I was cleaning my son's mansion when my DIL guests laughed at me. She added, 72 years and still a worthless old maid. A week later, my late husband's lawyer called. My name was on the company shares. When she found out, she demanded her cut. I smiled, poured her tea, and handed her the real documents. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The sound of crystal glasses clinking together drifted from the living room as I scrubbed the marble countertop for the third time that morning. My 72-year-old hands moved mechanically across the surface, muscle memory guiding me through a routine I'd performed countless times over the past 15 years. Debbie, did you remember to polish the silver? Camilla's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and commanding. My daughter-in-law never asked, she ordered. Even after all these years living under what used to be my roof, she still spoke to me like hired help. Yes, dear, I called back, my voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Everything's ready for your guests. Through the archway, I could see Camilla adjusting the fresh orchids I'd arranged earlier. She wore a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than what I used to spend on groceries in 3 months. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place. She looked every inch the lady of the manor, a role that should have been mine. The doorbell chimed, and I heard the excited chatter of women's voices as Camilla's friends arrived for their weekly tea gathering. These were the wives of successful businessmen, women who lunched at country clubs and vacationed in the Hamptons. They had embraced Camilla as one of their own from the moment she married my Scot. I retreated to the kitchen, staying out of sight as I'd learned to do. The less visible I was during these gatherings, the easier it was for everyone. I arranged delicate finger sandwiches on the bone china that had once been my grandmother's, now serving at Camilla's pleasure. Ladies, please make yourselves comfortable, I heard Camilla say, her voice warm and gracious, a tone she reserved for everyone except me. I've had some lovely refreshments prepared. She never mentioned who actually prepared them, never acknowledged the hours I spent shopping, cooking, and arranging everything to her exacting standards. To her friends, I was invisible, just another part of the household machinery that kept their comfortable world running smoothly. As I carried the tea service into the living room, the conversation flowed around me as if I weren't there. They discussed their children's achievements, their husbands' business successes, their upcoming charity galas. I moved silently between them, refilling cups and replacing empty plates, a ghost in my own former home. Oh, Camilla, you're so lucky to have such help, one of them said, gesturing vaguely in my direction without making eye contact. Good domestic help is so hard to find these days. Camilla smiled, not bothering to correct the assumption. Yes, well, you know how it is. Some people are just better suited for certain roles in life. The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. Better to endure in silence than to give Camilla ammunition for one of her lectures about gratitude and knowing one's place. As I bent to collect empty plates from the coffee table, I heard one of the women whisper, not quite quietly enough, "Isn't that Scott's mother? How old is she now?" 72. Another replied, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women used when discussing the unfortunate circumstances of others. Can you imagine? Still doing manual labor at her age. Camilla's laugh was like wind chimes in a hurricane, beautiful on the surface but sharp underneath. Well, some people never really learn to take care of themselves properly. At 72 years old and still a worthless old maid, what else would she do? The room fell silent for a moment, the cruelty of the statement hanging in the air like smoke. I straightened slowly, my arthritic hands trembling slightly as I clutched the serving tray. Every eye in the room was on me, some filled with pity, others with the uncomfortable fascination people have when witnessing someone else's humiliation. I suppose some of us are just meant to serve, one of them finally said, trying to smooth over the awkward moment. I walked back to the kitchen on unsteady legs, my face burning with shame. Behind me, the conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. their laughter echoing through the house that had once been filled with Harold's warm voice and my own dreams. In the safety of the kitchen, I set the tray down with shaking hands and gripped the edge of the counter. The woman who had once hosted dinner parties for Harold's business associates, who had decorated this house for Christmas mornings with Scott, who had planned garden parties and anniversary celebrations, that woman felt very far away now. 15 years. 15 years since Harold died and left me feeling lost and dependent. 15 years of watching my son Scott choose his wife over his mother at every turn. 15 years of being made to feel like a burden in the home where I'd raised my family and built my life. I thought about the woman I used to be, before Harold's sudden heart attack changed everything. I'd been confident then, secure in my place in the world, but grief and shock had made me vulnerable, and Camilla had swooped in like a hawk, reorganizing our lives according to her vision of how things should be. "It would be so much easier if you just moved in with us," she'd said after the funeral, her voice dripping with false concern. "The house is so big, and you shouldn't be alone. We can take care of everything, the finances, the upkeep. You won't have to worry about a thing." I'd been too numb to see the trap being set, too grateful for what seemed like kindness to recognize the cage being built around me. By the time I understood what was happening, Camilla had already established herself as the mistress of the house, and I had somehow become the help. The sound of the front door closing told me the tea party had ended. I heard Camilla's heels clicking across the marble floor as she returned to survey her domain. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, still radiant in her cream dress, but her expression had shifted to something harder. "The ladies enjoyed themselves," she said, as if granting me a favor by sharing this information. "Though I do think you could have been a bit more invisible today. Mrs. Wellington noticed how slowly you were moving." I nodded, not trusting my voice. What could I say? That my joints ached from years of hard work? That being called worthless in front of strangers had shaken me more than I cared to admit? "Scott will be home soon," Camilla continued, checking her reflection in the polished surface of the refrigerator. "He's had a difficult day at the office. I trust you'll have dinner ready and keep things quiet this evening." She left without waiting for a response, her heels clicking away toward the stairs. I heard her bedroom door close, leaving me alone with the aftermath of another day of small humiliations and casual cruelty. As I began preparing dinner, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, thin, tired, worn down by years of being told she didn't matter. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her clothes practical but plain. She looked exactly like what Camilla's friend had called her, an old maid who'd never learned to take care of herself. But as I stood there in the growing twilight, something stirred deep inside me. A tiny flame of the woman I used to be, the woman who had once commanded respect and love. Harold hadn't married a worthless old maid. He'd married a woman of substance, a woman who deserved better than this slow erosion of dignity and self-worth. I turned away from the window and continued preparing dinner, but something had shifted. The seed of change had been planted, though I didn't yet know what form it would take. Little did I know that in just 1 week, everything would begin to change in ways I never could have imagined. 7 days had passed since Camilla's tea party, and the sting of her words still lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I tried to push the memory away as I folded laundry in the utility room, but worthless old maid echoed in my mind with each precise crease I made in Scott's work shirts. The phone rang just as I was hanging his suits in the walk-in closet. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting to see another telemarketer or perhaps one of Camilla's friends. Instead, the name made me pause. Thompson and Associates, attorneys at law. My heart skipped. I knew that name. Richard Thompson had been Harold's lawyer for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to our wills. But I hadn't heard from him since those awful weeks after the funeral, when everything had been settled and signed. What could he possibly want after all this time? "Mrs. Winters?" The familiar voice was warm but carried an undertone of excitement I couldn't quite place. "This is Richard Thompson. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Not at all, Mr. Thompson. I clutched the phone tighter, my mind racing through possibilities. Is everything all right? Actually, yes, very much so. He cleared his throat. I'm calling because we've finally completed the processing of some documents that have been tied up in probate court for quite some time. Documents relating to your late husband's estate. I sank down onto the edge of the bed, confusion washing over me. I don't understand. I thought everything was settled years ago. So did we, Richard said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. But sometimes these things take longer than expected, especially when they involve corporate holdings that were established many years prior. The court system can be, shall we say, thorough to a fault. Corporate holdings? The words felt foreign in my mouth. Harold had worked for Morrison and Associates as their head of operations, but I'd never known him to own any part of the company, Richard. I think there might be some confusion. Oh no, Mrs. Winters. No confusion at all. His voice carried that same excitement from before. Your name appears on several documents that we've just received clearance to process. It seems Harold was more forward-thinking than any of us realized. My hands began to tremble. What kind of documents? I'd prefer to discuss this in person, if that's possible. There are some complexities involved that would be better explained face-to-face. Could you come to my office tomorrow morning? Say, 10 o'clock? I glanced at my mental schedule, cleaning the guest bathrooms, grocery shopping for the week, preparing Camila's lunch for her book club meeting. Tasks that had filled my days for 15 years. Each one a small reminder of how small my world had become. Yes, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. I can be there. Excellent. And Mrs. Winters? You might want to bring some form of identification. We'll need to verify your signature on several items. After hanging up, I sat in the silence of Scott and Camila's bedroom, staring at the phone in my hand. Harold had been gone for 15 years. What could possibly be left to settle? I thought back to those chaotic months after his death. Camilla had taken charge of everything with an efficiency that had seemed like a blessing at the time. She'd coordinated with lawyers, handled paperwork, organized the financial arrangements that allowed me to stay in the house. I'd been too devastated to pay close attention to the details, trusting that Harold's affairs were being properly managed. Scott will handle the business side of things, Camilla had said, her hand gentle on my shoulder as I signed document after document. You shouldn't have to worry about complicated financial matters during such a difficult time. Now I wondered what I might have missed in my grief-stricken haze. The sound of the garage door opening snapped me back to the present. Camilla was home from her Pilates class, which meant I had exactly 15 minutes to start dinner before she began making pointed comments about the delay. I hurried downstairs, the phone call weighing on my mind as I moved through the familiar motions of meal preparation. Should I mention it to Scott and Camilla? Part of me wanted to, if only to share the mystery with someone. But another part, a part that had grown stronger since the tea party, hesitated. Camilla breezed into the kitchen wearing her yoga outfit and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just spent 2 hours being pampered. "How was your day, Debbie?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly interested in the answer. "Quiet," I replied, focused on seasoning the chicken. "Productive." She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, her movements graceful and deliberate. "I ran into Mrs. Henderson at the club today. She mentioned that their housekeeper just gave notice. Apparently, she found a position with a family who actually appreciates good help." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Camilla had perfected this art over the years, the ability to criticize without actually saying anything directly confrontational. "I hope she finds happiness in her new position," I said carefully. "Yes, well, loyalty is such a rare quality these days." Camilla twisted the cap off her water with unnecessary force. "People think they can just walk away from their responsibilities whenever they feel like it." Before I could respond, Scott's voice echoed from the front hall. "I'm home!" My son appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, loosening his tie with the weary expression of someone who'd spent the day fighting battles he couldn't win. At 45, Scott still had Harold's strong jawline and thick brown hair, though stress had added lines around his eyes that made him look older than his years. Rough day? Camilla asked, immediately shifting into attentive wife mode. She moved to him and straightened his collar, her touch possessive and caring in equal measure. Morrison's pushing back on the quarterly projections again, Scott said, accepting the glass of whiskey Camilla had somehow produced without me noticing. Sometimes I think Dad had the right idea, staying in operations instead of trying to climb the corporate ladder. I paused in my dinner preparations. Scott rarely mentioned Harold anymore, and when he did, it was usually in the context of business advice or lessons learned. But there was something wistful in his voice tonight, a longing for simpler times that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Your father was a wise man," I said quietly, testing the words in the air between us. Scott glanced at me, his expression softening for just a moment. Yeah, he was. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think about how things turned out. Camilla's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Scott's arm. "He'd be proud of how far you've come, darling. You've accomplished so much more than he ever did." The moment of connection dissolved, replaced by Camilla's careful redirection. She had a talent for that, taking any conversation that might lead to uncomfortable territory and steering it back to safer ground. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, I announced, turning back to the stove. As they left the kitchen, I heard Camilla's voice in the hallway. "Did you remember to call the insurance company about the car? And we need to discuss the Henderson party next weekend. I was thinking we might need extra help." Their voices faded as they climbed the stairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of Richard Thompson's mysterious phone call. That night, after Scott and Camilla had gone to bed, I found myself standing in Harold's old study. The room had been converted into Camilla's home office years ago, but she'd kept his desk, a massive oak piece that had belonged to his father. I ran my fingers along its polished surface, remembering the countless evenings Harold had spent here, working on reports or reviewing contracts. He'd been methodical about everything, keeping detailed records and filing every important document with obsessive care. If there were corporate holdings I didn't know about, he would have documented them somewhere. But Camilla had gone through everything after his death, organizing and filing according to her own system. I pulled open the bottom drawer, the one where Harold used to keep his most important papers. It was empty, except for a small stack of Camilla's business cards and a few promotional materials for the country club. A sound in the hallway made me freeze, my heart hammering against my ribs. But it was just the house settling, the creaks and sighs of a place growing old. I closed the drawer and headed upstairs, the phone call still echoing in my mind. Tomorrow I would learn what Richard Thompson had discovered. Tomorrow I might finally understand why Harold's estate had taken 15 years to fully settle. And tomorrow, perhaps, I would begin to understand that the man I'd loved for 30 years had been protecting me in ways I'd never imagined. As I lay in my small bedroom, the guest room I'd occupied since Camilla decided the master suite would be better utilized by the younger couple, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Richard Thompson's law office occupied the top floor of a historic building downtown, its windows offering a sweeping view of the city Harold and I had called home for over 30 years. As the elevator carried me upward, my hands trembled around the strap of my simple black purse, the same one I'd carried for the past 8 years because buying a new one seemed frivolous when every dollar counted. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, led me through a mahogany-paneled hallway lined with portraits of distinguished lawyers from decades past. Richard's office was exactly as I remembered it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that commanded respect, and the faint scent of leather and old paper that spoke of important matters handled with discretion. "Debbie." Richard rose from behind his desk, extending his hand with genuine warmth. At 78, he moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent his life solving other people's problems. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "Of course." I settled into the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd sat 15 years ago, signing papers through a haze of grief. "I have to admit, I'm quite puzzled by all this." Richard adjusted his glasses and opened a thick manila folder. "I don't blame you. What I'm about to share with you is, well, it's extraordinary. And frankly, It explains a great deal about why Harold was so insistent on certain legal structures that seemed excessive at the time. He pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. The letterhead read Morrison and Associates, but the rest was a maze of legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Harold never told you about his partnership stake in Morrison and Associates, did he? Richard asked gently. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. Partnership stake? Harold was an employee. He worked in operations. He was both, Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of a revelation he'd clearly been waiting years to deliver. In 1992, when the company was struggling financially, Harold invested his entire inheritance from his father, $50,000, to help keep Morrison afloat. In exchange, he received a 20% partnership stake. The room seemed to tilt around me. 20%? But that would mean that's not all. Richard pulled out another document. Over the years, Harold continued to invest in the company, particularly during the expansion in the late 90s. By the time of his death, his stake had grown to 40% of Morrison and Associates. I stared at the papers, the numbers and percentages swimming before my eyes. Morrison and Associates was one of the most successful consulting firms in the region. 40% of that company would be worth. How much? I whispered. Richard consulted another paper. Based on the most recent valuation, approximately $4.2 million. The air left my lungs in a rush. $4.2 million. The number was so large it seemed impossible, like something that existed only in other people's lives. I thought of the countless times I'd worried about money over the past 15 years, the careful budgeting, the small economies I'd practiced to avoid being more of a burden. I don't understand, I managed. If Harold owned 40% of the company, why didn't I know? Why wasn't this part of his estate? Richard's expression grew grave. It was part of his estate, but Harold had established very specific conditions for when this inheritance would be transferred to you. The documents were sealed and could only be opened 15 years after his death. 15 years? Why 15 years? According to Harold's instructions, he wanted to ensure that any inheritance you received would be yours alone, free from the influence of what he termed interested parties who might not have your best interests at heart. Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. He was quite specific about wanting you to have time to understand your true circumstances before gaining access to these assets. I felt a chill run down my spine. Harold had known. Somehow he'd foreseen what would happen after his death, how I would be marginalized and controlled. He'd anticipated that I would need protection, even from our own family. There's more, Richard continued. Harold also established a trust fund that has been accumulating interest for the past 15 years. The current balance is approximately $800,000. $800,000, in addition to the $4.2 million. I gripped the arms of my chair, feeling dizzy. The trust was designed to provide you with immediate liquidity, Richard explained. Harold knew that accessing the partnership stake might take some time, given the complex nature of corporate ownership transfers. I stared at the papers scattered across Richard's desk, each one representing a piece of Harold's elaborate plan to protect me. He never said anything, not one word about any of this. Harold was concerned about the legal implications of discussing these arrangements while they were being established. He also wanted to protect you from any pressure that might arise if certain family members became aware of the full extent of his assets. Family members. Richard was too polite to say names, but we both knew he meant Camilla. Harold had seen through her from the beginning, recognizing something I'd been too naive or too kind to acknowledge. What happens now? I asked. Now these assets are legally yours. Richard slid a pen across the desk. I'll need your signature on several documents to complete the transfer process. The trust fund can be accessible within 24 hours. The partnership stake will take a bit longer, perhaps a week or two, but it will provide you with a substantial quarterly income for the rest of your life. As I signed document after document, my mind reeled with the implications. I wasn't poor, I wasn't dependent. I wasn't the worthless old maid Camilla had declared me to be. I was a wealthy woman who had been kept in ignorance of her own circumstances for 15 years. "Richard," I said as he notarized the final signature, "who else knows about this?" "No one except my office staff, and they're bound by attorney-client privilege. The partnership stake was held in a private trust that Morrison's management wasn't even aware of. As far as anyone knows, Harold Winters was simply a valued employee who died 15 years ago." I nodded, though my thoughts were churning. Scott and Camilla had no idea that the woman they'd treated as unpaid household help was actually wealthier than they were. The irony was almost overwhelming. "There is one more thing," Richard said, reaching into his desk drawer. "Harold left this for you, with instructions that it only be given to you when the rest of his estate was finally settled." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Harold's familiar handwriting. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "My dearest Debbie, if you're reading this, then 15 years have passed since my death, and you're finally learning the truth about what I've left for you. I pray that these have been good years, filled with love and respect from our family. But if they haven't been, if you've been made to feel small or worthless or dependent, then I want you to know that I saw this possibility and tried to protect you from it. You are not now, nor have you ever been, a burden to anyone. You are a woman of strength and grace who deserves to be cherished, not diminished. The money I've left you isn't just an inheritance. It's your freedom to choose how you want to spend whatever years remain to you. Use it wisely, use it joyfully, and if anyone tries to make you feel guilty for claiming what is rightfully yours, remember that I planned this specifically to prevent such manipulation. You were the love of my life, and you deserve to be treated as such. All my love, Harold." Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my purse. Harold had known. He'd seen what I'd been too trusting to see, and he'd spent years crafting a plan to protect me from it. "Are you all right?" Richard asked gently. I wiped my eyes and straightened my shoulders. Yes, I think I am." As I left Richard's office and walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years. Power. Not the cruel power that Camilla wielded through manipulation and control, but the quiet power that came from having options. For the first time since Harold's death, I wasn't going home because I had nowhere else to go. I was going home because I chose to, and because I had things to think about. The drive back to the house passed in a blur of possibilities. I could buy my own home. I could travel. I could live independently without asking anyone's permission or worrying about being a burden. But first, I needed to decide what to do about Scott and Camilla. They had no idea that everything was about to change, that the old woman they'd dismissed and diminished had just become one of the wealthiest people they knew. As I pulled into the driveway of the house that had once been mine, I made a decision. I wouldn't tell them about the inheritance immediately. I wanted time to think, time to plan, time to decide how I wanted to handle this transformation. Harold had given me the gift of financial independence. Now I needed to decide how to use it. The front door opened before I could reach it, and Camilla appeared on the threshold, her expression sharp with curiosity. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "I needed you to pick up my dry cleaning this morning." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. She was still beautiful, still perfectly put together, still carrying herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed her deference. "I had an appointment," I said calmly. "What kind of appointment? You should have asked permission before scheduling anything during the day. There are responsibilities here that need to be handled." I walked past her into the house, Harold's letter burning like a secret fire in my purse. "I'll pick up your dry cleaning this afternoon," I said. But as I climbed the stairs to my small room, I was already planning for a future where picking up Camilla's dry cleaning would be a choice, not an obligation. A future where I would never again be called a worthless old maid by anyone. 3 days had passed since my visit to Richard Thompson's office, and I'd managed to keep Harold's secret locked away like a precious treasure. The knowledge sat inside me like a warm coal, glowing brighter each time Camilla issued another order or made another cutting remark about my usefulness. The trust fund money had been deposited into a new account Richard had helped me establish, $800,000 that belonged entirely to me. I'd stared at the bank statement for a full 10 minutes that morning, still hardly believing the numbers were real. But keeping such a massive secret proved more challenging than I'd anticipated, especially when Camilla's behavior seemed designed to test my patience at every turn. "The guest bathroom needs to be cleaned again," she announced as I finished preparing lunch. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned yesterday that she noticed water spots on the mirror." I bit back the response that rose to my lips. Mrs. Patterson had been in the guest bathroom for exactly 30 seconds, and I'd cleaned that mirror the same morning. But arguing would only lead to one of Camilla's lectures about maintaining standards. "Of course," I said instead, marveling at how the same words that once felt like defeat now felt like a choice I was making temporarily. Camilla studied me with narrowed eyes. "You seem different lately." Distracted. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "That appointment the other day. What was it really about?" The lie came easier than I expected. "Just a routine checkup with Dr. Morrison. Nothing important." She seemed to accept this, though her gaze lingered on me a moment longer than comfortable. "Well, make sure your health issues don't interfere with your responsibilities here. Scott has been under tremendous pressure at work, and the last thing he needs is household disruptions." That afternoon, as I cleaned the guest bathroom that didn't need cleaning, I found myself thinking about Scott. My son had grown into a successful man, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost the warmth that had defined him as a child. He rarely spoke to me anymore beyond polite pleasantries, and when he did, it felt like he was talking to hired help rather than the woman who'd raised him. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that I'd barely noticed it happening. Camilla had a gift for that, reshaping relationships with such delicate precision that the changes felt natural, inevitable. I was still lost in these thoughts when I heard raised voices coming from Scott's study downstairs. The tone was urgent, angry even, which was unusual. Scott typically avoided confrontation, especially at home. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear what had upset them. "Absolutely certain?" Scott's voice carried a note of panic I rarely heard from him. "I'm telling you, something's going on," Camilla replied, her usual composure cracking slightly. "She's been acting strange ever since that mysterious appointment, and today I caught her looking at some kind of paperwork in her room." My blood turned to ice. I thought I'd been careful, but apparently Camilla's surveillance skills were better than I'd given her credit for. "Maybe it's nothing," Scott said, though he sounded uncertain. "Medical bills, insurance papers. No, this was different. Legal-looking documents. And she hid them the moment she saw me in the doorway." I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering. If Camilla had seen Richard's papers. "I think we need to find out what she's hiding," Camilla continued. "What if it's something that affects us? What if she's planning to, I don't know, move out? Leave us high and dry?" The idea that I might leave seemed to terrify them both, though not for the reasons one might expect from loving family members. Their panic was purely practical. Who would cook and clean and manage the household tasks they'd grown accustomed to having handled for free? "I'll talk to her," Scott said finally. "Tonight, after dinner, we'll get to the bottom of this." I retreated to my room, my mind racing. I wasn't ready for this confrontation. I hadn't decided how I wanted to handle the revelation of my inheritance, and being forced into disclosure before I was prepared felt like losing control of the situation. But perhaps this was inevitable. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. Scott kept glancing at me over his plate of pot roast, clearly working up the courage for whatever conversation Camilla had demanded. She, meanwhile, maintained her usual performance of gracious hostess, while her eyes tracked my every movement like a predator studying prey. "Mother?" Scott said finally, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "Camilla mentioned that you've seemed different lately. Is everything all right?" The word mother sounded strange coming from him. He usually called me Mom when he addressed me directly, though more often he simply avoided using any name at all. "I'm fine, dear," I replied, cutting my meat into smaller pieces to buy time. Just the usual aches and pains of getting older. It's not your health we're concerned about, Camilla interjected, abandoning all pretense of subtlety. It's your behavior. The secretive phone calls, the mysterious appointments, the legal documents you're hiding in your room. Scott's eyebrows rose. Legal documents. I set down my knife and fork, my hands surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I wasn't aware that my personal affairs were subject to household scrutiny. Camilla's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Personal affairs? Debbie, you live in our house, eat our food, depend on our charity for everything you have. Your affairs stopped being purely personal the day you became our responsibility. The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to remind me of my place in their hierarchy. But instead of the usual shame and diminishment, I felt something else rising inside me. Anger. Your responsibility? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Yes, Camilla said, leaning forward slightly. We've supported you for 15 years. We've given you a home, security, purpose. The least you can do is be honest about whatever schemes you're cooking up. Schemes? The word came out as a laugh, though there was no humor in it. Scott shifted uncomfortably. Mom, we're not trying to attack you. We're just concerned. If something's going on, if you're in some kind of trouble, we want to help. But Camilla wasn't finished. I think we have a right to know if you're planning to abandon the family that's taken care of you all these years. If you're considering moving into some senior facility or whatever it is you're plotting. The assumption that I was plotting against them, that any action I might take would be a betrayal of their generosity, revealed so much about how they truly saw me. I was property to them, an asset they'd invested in and expected to control indefinitely. You want to know about the documents? I asked, my voice growing stronger with each word. They both nodded, Camilla with eager anticipation, Scott with nervous dread. They're legal papers related to your father's estate, I said, watching Scott's expression carefully. It seems there were some assets that took 15 years to clear probate. Scott frowned. What kind of assets? Dad's estate was settled years ago. Apparently, not entirely. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate with careful precision. It turns out your father owned a significant stake in Morrison & Associates, 40% to be exact. The silence that followed was deafening. Scott's face went pale, while Camilla's eyes grew wide with something that looked like hunger. 40%? Scott whispered. That's millions of dollars. 4.2 million, according to the most recent valuation, I confirmed, plus a trust fund that's been accumulating interest for 15 years. Camilla was the first to recover from the shock. Well, she said, her voice carefully controlled, this changes things considerably, doesn't it? I met her gaze steadily. Does it? Of course it does. She was already shifting into planning mode, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. We'll need to restructure our financial arrangements, establish proper investment accounts, maybe consult with a financial advisor about tax implications. We? I interrupted. Camilla blinked as if the question surprised her. Well, yes, this is a family windfall. We'll all benefit from proper management of these assets. The audacity was breathtaking. In the space of 5 minutes, she'd gone from calling me a burden they supported out of charity to assuming she'd be managing my inheritance. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I said, my voice growing colder. These assets belong to me, not to the family, not to Scott, to me. Now, wait a minute, Camilla said, her composure finally cracking. You can't seriously be planning to hoard this money like some selfish miser. After everything we've done for you, after all the years we've supported you. Supported me? I stood up slowly, my 72-year-old frame suddenly feeling stronger than it had in years. You've treated me like unpaid household staff for 15 years. You've humiliated me in front of your friends, dismissed my contributions, and made me feel like a burden in my own home. Scott looked stricken. Mom, that's not. We never meant. Didn't you? I turned to him, this son I'd raised and loved, who'd stood by silently while his wife erased me from the family narrative. When was the last time you asked about my day? My feelings? My dreams? When was the last time you treated me like your mother instead of like an elderly relative you're obligated to tolerate? That's not fair, Camilla snapped. We've given you everything. You've given me a roof over my head in exchange for free labor, I interrupted. You've given me a place at your table in exchange for cooking the meals. You've given me exactly what you needed me to have to keep me useful. The truth hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years. So what now? Camilla asked, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. You're going to take your money and abandon us? Leave us scrambling to replace 15 years of unpaid work? Arka! I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who'd systematically dismantled my sense of worth while convincing everyone it was kindness. I'm going to take some time to think about what I want to do with the rest of my life, I said finally. Something I haven't been able to do for 15 years. I walked out of the dining room, leaving them sitting at the table with their half-finished meals and their shattered assumptions. As I climbed the stairs to my small room, I could hear them talking in urgent whispers behind me, planning, no doubt, strategizing how to maintain control over both me and my newfound wealth. But Harold had been right to wait 15 years. I'd needed this time to understand exactly what I was being saved from. The next morning brought an artificial calm to the house, the kind of forced normalcy that follows an earthquake when everyone pretends the ground isn't still shaking beneath their feet. Camilla appeared in the kitchen wearing her most conciliatory smile, the one she typically reserved for smoothing over social awkwardness at charity functions. "Good morning, Debbie," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "I hope you slept well. I know yesterday's conversation was intense." I continued preparing Scott's breakfast, cracking eggs into the skillet with steady hands despite the tension crackling in the air. "I slept fine, thank you." "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Camilla continued, settling gracefully into one of the breakfast nook chairs. "About feeling unappreciated, and I want you to know that Scott and I never intended to make you feel that way." Her tone was perfect, concerned, slightly hurt, but willing to make amends. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I might have fallen for it once, but Harold's letter had opened my eyes to patterns I'd been blind to for years. "That's kind of you to say," I replied neutrally. "I think we need to sit down and have a proper family discussion about this inheritance," she said, watching my face carefully, "about how we can make sure everyone's needs are met fairly." There it was, the real purpose behind her morning charm offensive. Scott appeared in the doorway, looking haggard. He'd clearly spent a sleepless night processing the revelation that his supposedly poor mother was actually wealthier than he was. "Morning, Mom," he said, accepting the plate I offered him. "Listen, about last night. I think we all said things we didn't mean. Maybe we should start over." I poured coffee for both of them, my movements deliberate and calm. "What did you have in mind?" Camilla leaned forward eagerly. "Well, first, I think we need to acknowledge that this inheritance affects all of us. We're a family, and families share in each other's good fortune." "Do they?" I asked mildly. "In my experience, this family has been quite selective about what gets shared." Scott winced, but Camilla pressed on. "This could be a fresh start for all of us, a chance to build something wonderful together. We could invest in Scott's career, maybe buy a vacation home where we could all spend time together." I noticed how quickly my inheritance had become our money in her mind. The transformation was so smooth it was almost impressive. "I'm not sure I'm ready to make any major financial decisions yet," I said. "This is all very new to me." Camilla's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. But surely you understand that letting such a large sum just sit in a bank account isn't wise. Inflation alone will eat away at its value." She'd done her homework overnight, clearly researching investment strategies and tax implications. I had to admire her efficiency, even as I recognized the trap being set. "I've actually arranged to meet with Richard Thompson again this afternoon," I said, "to discuss the best way to manage these assets." Both Scott and Camilla straightened at this news. "That's wonderful," Camilla said quickly. "I think Scott should come with you. After all, he has an MBA and years of experience with corporate finance. He could be invaluable in helping you navigate such complex decisions." "Actually," Scott added, "I think we should all go. This affects the whole family, and we should approach it as a team. I sipped my coffee, buying time to consider my response. Part of me wanted to refuse outright, to assert my independence and shut down their attempts at control, but another part, the part that had learned from Harold's strategic thinking, saw an opportunity. "That's very generous of you both," I said finally. "But I think it's important that I handle this initial phase on my own. After all, I need to understand my options before I can make informed decisions about sharing them." Camilla's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of frustration. "Debbie, I hope you're not planning to shut us out of this process. After everything we've been through together as a family." "I'm not shutting anyone out," I said firmly. "I'm simply taking the time I need to understand what Harold left for me." The emphasis on my late husband's name was deliberate. Both Scott and Camilla had spent years minimizing Harold's memory, treating him as a footnote in their lives, rather than the man who'd built the foundation they all stood on. "Fine," Camilla said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "But I hope you'll consider inviting us to the next meeting. This is too important to handle alone." After they left for work, Scott to his job at Morrison & Associates, where he unknowingly worked for a company his mother now partially owned, and Camilla to her volunteer position at the art museum. I found myself alone with my thoughts for the first time since the revelation. The house felt different now that I knew I didn't have to be there. Every room I'd cleaned, every meal I'd prepared, every small humiliation I'd endured, they all took on a different character when viewed through the lens of choice rather than obligation. I spent the morning doing what I'd done for 15 years, cleaning, organizing, maintaining the household that had become my prison. But this time, I did it while planning my escape. My phone rang just after lunch. Richard Thompson's familiar voice carried a note of urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Debbie, I'm glad I caught you. I've had some interesting calls this morning." "Oh?" "It seems someone has been making inquiries about Harold's estate, specifically about any corporate holdings that might not have been properly disclosed at the time of his death." My stomach dropped. "What kind of inquiries?" "The calls came from Morrison & Associates' legal department. They're asking about Harold's employment contract and whether there were any equity agreements that their current records might not reflect." I gripped the phone tighter. How would they even know to ask about that? "That's an excellent question. As far as I know, only you, myself, and my office staff were aware of Harold's partnership stake. Unless someone told them," I finished, my mind racing to the obvious conclusion. "It's possible that someone in your family contacted Morrison directly, perhaps thinking they were being helpful, or perhaps fishing for information." I closed my eyes, seeing Camilla's calculating expression from that morning. She'd been too calm, too prepared with her investment advice and financial planning suggestions. She'd spent the night doing more than just researching portfolio management. "What does this mean for the inheritance?" I asked. "Legally, nothing. The documents are ironclad, and Harold's ownership stake is well documented. But it does mean that Morrison's management will now be aware that they have a new partner. That could complicate things." After hanging up, I sat in Harold's old study, now Camilla's office, and tried to piece together what had happened. Camilla was too smart to make direct inquiries herself, but she had connections throughout the city's social and business networks. A casual conversation with the right person, a strategic question posed as innocent curiosity. The phone rang again an hour later. This time it was Scott, and his voice was tight with anxiety. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you meet me at Morrison's office? There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "Just, please come. And Mom, don't sign anything or agree to anything without talking to me first." The Morrison & Associates building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel that had always intimidated me during the few times I'd visited Harold there years ago. Now, walking through the marble-lined lobby, I felt different. I wasn't the grieving widow being escorted to sign paperwork. I was a major shareholder arriving to claim what was mine. Scott met me at the elevator, his face pale and drawn. "They know," he said without preamble. "Morrison's entire executive team knows about Dad's partnership stake." "How?" He looked uncomfortable. "Camilla thought it would be helpful to reach out to some contacts, just to get a sense of how these things usually work. She called Patricia Morrison, you remember from the country club. We thought a casual inquiry. You thought wrong, I said coldly. The elevator carried us to the executive floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. We were led to a conference room where 3 men in expensive suits waited with briefcases and serious expressions. Mrs. Winters, the oldest of them said, rising to shake my hand. I'm James Morrison, Patricia's husband, and the current CEO of Morrison & Associates. I believe you knew my father. I had indeed known his father, a kind man who'd treated Harold with respect and genuine friendship. This James Morrison carried himself with the cold efficiency of someone who'd inherited power rather than earned it. We understand there's been some confusion about your late husband's relationship with this company, he continued, gesturing for us to sit. We'd like to clear that up as quickly as possible. I'm not sure what confusion you're referring to, I said calmly. My husband owned 40% of this company. The legal documents are quite clear. James exchanged glances with his colleagues. Yes, well, that's what we need to discuss. You see, the company has changed considerably since your husband's time. We've expanded, restructured, taken on new partners. The original partnership agreement your husband signed. It may not be as straightforward to implement as you might think. I felt Scott tense beside me. What exactly are you saying? We're saying that while we respect Mrs. Winters' legal claim, the practical implementation of that claim could be complicated, disruptive to current operations, potentially damaging to the company's value. Another suit leaned forward. However, we're prepared to make a generous offer to purchase Mrs. Winters' stake, $2.5 million, paid immediately, in exchange for a full release of any claims against the company. The number hung in the air between us. $2.5 million, a substantial sum, but nearly $2 million less than the stake was actually worth. That seems fair, Scott said quickly, clearly relieved at the prospect of a simple resolution. But I was thinking of Harold's letter, of his warning about people who might not have my best interests at heart. This offer wasn't generosity. It was an attempt to buy me out at a discount before I fully understood the value of what I owned. I'll need time to consider this, I said. James Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. Of course, but I should mention that this offer is contingent on a quick resolution. Market conditions are volatile. The longer this drags out, the less we'll be able to offer. It was a threat, politely delivered but unmistakable in its intent. As we left the building, Scott was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Mom, you have to take this deal. $2.5 million is more money than most people see in a lifetime. It's also less than what Harold's stake is worth, I pointed out. But it's guaranteed. If you try to fight them, it could drag on for years. Legal fees alone could eat up hundreds of thousands of dollars. I studied my son's face, seeing the fear there. Not fear for my welfare, but fear that this windfall might slip away, taking with it all the financial security he'd been counting on. I'm going to sleep on it, I said finally. That evening, Camilla served dinner with the same artificial cheerfulness she'd displayed that morning. But I could see the calculation in her eyes, the careful monitoring of my every expression. Scott told me about the meeting, she said as she set down my plate. What an exciting opportunity. $2.5 million. Think of all the good we could do with that money. There it was again. The automatic assumption that my inheritance belonged to all of us. It's certainly a substantial sum, I agreed, and so practical, she continued. A clean break, no ongoing complications. We could invest it properly, maybe set up college funds for the grandchildren we hope to have someday. I nearly choked on my water. Grandchildren they'd been planning without ever consulting me, using money they assumed they'd control. Of course, Camilla added casually. If you decide to keep the partnership stake instead, we'd want to make sure you have proper guidance. Corporate ownership is so complex. It would be irresponsible to let you navigate that alone. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Take the buyout and let them manage the money, or keep the partnership and let them manage that too. Either way, they maintained control while I provided the assets. But Harold had spent 15 years teaching me that some cages are built with golden bars. I've decided to accept Morrison's offer, I said quietly. Both Scott and Camilla sagged with relief. But, I continued, I'll be managing the proceeds myself. The relief evaporated instantly. Debbie, Camilla said carefully, that's a lot of responsibility for someone who's never handled investments. Then I suppose I'll learn, I said, meeting her gaze steadily. Later that night, alone in my small room, I called Richard Thompson. I've decided to reject Morrison's offer, I told him. Good, he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Because I spent the afternoon reviewing Harold's partnership agreement. Not only is their offer significantly below market value, but your stake actually includes voting rights that could give you considerable influence over company decisions. What kind of influence? The kind that makes $2.5 million look like pocket change, Richard said. Harold wasn't just an investor, Debbie. With 40% ownership, he was positioned to be a kingmaker. And now, so are you. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Harold's final gift wasn't just money. It was power. The power to choose my own destiny. To demand respect rather than beg for it. Tomorrow, I would begin using that power. And Camilla was about to learn that the worthless old maid she'd dismissed so casually was actually the most dangerous person she'd ever underestimated. I woke before dawn on what I knew would be my last morning in this house. The bedroom that had been my refuge for 15 years felt smaller now, cramped with the weight of decisions I'd finally found the courage to make. Outside my window, the garden Harold and I had planted together was just beginning to show the first hints of spring, daffodils pushing through the dark soil, promising renewal. My suitcases sat packed and ready by the door, containing only the things that truly belonged to me. Photographs of Harold, the jewelry he'd given me, clothes that predated Camilla's subtle suggestions about appropriate attire for someone my age. Everything else I was leaving behind, just as I was leaving behind the woman who'd lived in this room. The diminished, grateful woman who'd accepted scraps of affection as though they were feast. Downstairs, I prepared breakfast one final time, my movements automatic after years of repetition. The familiar sounds of the house waking up, pipes groaning, floorboards creaking, the coffee maker gurgling to life, would soon be replaced by other sounds in my new apartment across town. A place where no one would judge the noise I made or question my right to be there. Camilla appeared first, as she always did, perfectly groomed even at 6:30 in the morning. She'd clearly spent considerable time on her appearance today, wearing a navy blue dress that suggested serious business and the pearl necklace she reserved for important occasions. "Good morning, Debbie," she said, her voice carrying an undertone of excitement she couldn't quite suppress. "Ready for your big day?" Today was the day I was supposed to meet with Morrison's lawyers to finalize the buyout agreement. At least that's what I'd told Scott and Camilla last night. In reality, today was the day I would walk into Morrison & Associates as a major shareholder and begin exercising the power Harold had carefully preserved for me. "I suppose I am," I replied, sliding eggs onto her plate with hands that no longer trembled. Scott joined us a few minutes later, adjusting his tie with the nervous energy of someone anticipating a windfall. He'd already started talking about investment strategies, mentioning a financial advisor he knew who specialized in managing sudden wealth. $2.5 million is a good start, he'd said yesterday. But with proper planning, we could turn it into so much more. We, always we, as though my inheritance was a family project rather than my personal liberation. "I should probably drive you to the meeting," Scott said now, cutting into his toast with precise movements. "These legal documents can be tricky. You'll want someone there who understands the business implications." "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I'm capable of handling this myself." Camilla set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink. "Debbie, I know you want to feel independent, but this isn't the time for pride. A mistake at this stage could cost everyone thousands of dollars." Everyone. As though she and Scott would be the ones suffering if I made an error. "Besides," she continued, "what will you do with yourself afterward? You'll have more money than you know what to do with. but no purpose, no structure to your days. At least here you have responsibilities that keep you active. The suggestion that my life had value only insofar as it served their needs was so breathtakingly arrogant that I almost laughed. Instead, I finished my coffee and stood up. "I should get ready," I said. "The meeting is at 9. In my room, I dressed carefully in the one good suit I still owned, navy blue wool that Harold had bought me for our 30th anniversary. It still fit perfectly, and wearing it made me feel like the woman I'd been before grief and manipulation had hollowed me out. I was adjusting my earrings when Camilla appeared in my doorway without knocking, a habit that had always irritated me, but which I'd never protested. "I wanted to give you this," she said, holding out a manila folder. "It's some information about investment opportunities, conservative options that would provide steady income without too much risk." I accepted the folder, noting how thoroughly she'd researched ways to manage money that didn't belong to her. "There's also some paperwork for setting up a family trust," she continued. "Tax advantages, estate planning benefits. It would protect the money for future generations. Future generations meaning Scott, and eventually the children he and Camilla plan to have. Children who would inherit wealth built on Harold's foresight while I became a footnote in their family history." "You've been very thorough," I said neutrally. "I just want to make sure you're protected, Debbie. You're not used to handling large sums of money, and there are people out there who take advantage of elderly widows." The irony was so perfect it took my breath away. Here was the person who'd been taking advantage of me for 15 years, warning me about other predators. "I'll certainly keep that in mind," I said. An hour later, I walked into the Morrison & Associates building for the second time in 3 days. But this time, I was alone. No Scott hovering anxiously at my elbow. No Camilla's voice echoing in my head with instructions about what I should and shouldn't say. Richard Thompson met me in the lobby, his presence both reassuring and necessary. Over the past week, he'd become not just my lawyer but my strategist, helping me navigate waters that Harold had mapped out years ago. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we rode the elevator to the executive floor. "I've been ready for 15 years, I replied. "I just didn't know it." The conference room was fuller this time. James Morrison was there, along with his legal team, but they'd also brought in several other executives, men and women who'd clearly spent the past 3 days trying to figure out how to handle the Harold Winters situation. "Mrs. Winters," James said, rising to greet me. "I trust you've given our offer careful consideration." "I have," I said, taking a seat at the conference table. "And I've decided to decline." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. James exchanged glances with his colleagues, clearly thrown by my refusal of what they'd assumed was an irresistible offer. "I see," he said carefully. "May I ask why? If it's a matter of price, we might be able to negotiate." "It's not about price," I said calmly. "It's about respect." Richard opened his briefcase and began placing documents on the table. "Mrs. Winters has reviewed Harold's original partnership agreement, and she's chosen to exercise her rights as a shareholder rather than sell them." "Her rights?" one of the other executives asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Full partnership status," Richard explained, "which includes voting rights on major corporate decisions, access to financial records, and a seat on the board of directors." I watched James Morrison's face cycle through several emotions: surprise, anger, and finally, a grudging respect. He'd underestimated me, assuming that a 72-year-old widow would be easily intimidated into accepting their lowball offer. "Mrs. Winters," he said slowly, "I'm not sure you understand the complexity of running a modern consulting firm. The hours are demanding. The decisions are critical." "Mr. Morrison," I interrupted, "I'm not interested in running your company, but I am interested in protecting my late husband's investment and ensuring that his partnership stake is treated with the respect it deserves." "What exactly does that mean?" another executive asked. Richard smiled. "It means that Mrs. Winters will be taking an active role in governance. She'll be attending board meetings, reviewing quarterly reports, and exercising her considerable voting power in company decisions." The implications were clear. With 40% ownership, I could block any major initiative they wanted to pursue. I could demand transparency in operations that had probably become sloppy in the years since Harold's death. I could, if I chose, make their lives very difficult. Perhaps we could reconsider our buyout offer, James said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. 3 million? 3.5? Point. I'm not interested in selling, I said firmly. The meeting lasted another hour, with Morrison's team trying various approaches to convince me to reconsider. They offered to increase the purchase price to $4 million. They suggested a gradual buyout spread over several years. They even proposed keeping me as a silent partner with no actual responsibilities. I declined them all. Finally, Richard and I left them to contemplate their new reality. As we walked back to the parking garage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the intoxicating sensation of being in control of my own destiny. How do you feel? Richard asked. Powerful, I said, and the word tasted like freedom. My next stop was the bank, where I closed the joint account Camilla had insisted on opening years ago for household expenses, an account that had given her complete visibility into my limited finances. Then I opened a new account in my name alone and transferred the trust fund money Richard had helped me access. $800,000. More than enough to start over, to build whatever life I chose for myself. By the time I returned to the house, Scott and Camilla were pacing the living room like caged animals. They'd clearly expected me to return hours ago with signed papers and a check for $2.5 million. Where have you been? Camilla demanded the moment I walked through the door. The meeting was supposed to end at 10. It did end at 10, I said calmly. I had other errands to run afterward. Well? Scott asked anxiously. How did it go? Did you get the check? I set my purse down carefully and looked at them both. My son who'd forgotten how to see me as his mother, and the woman who'd systematically dismantled my sense of worth while convincing everyone it was kindness. I didn't take their offer, I said. The silence that followed was profound. You didn't, Scott started, then stopped, his face going pale. Mom, please tell me you're joking. I decided to keep Harold's partnership stake, I continued. I'll be taking an active role in the company as a board member and major shareholder. Camilla's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice in spring. You did what? Debbie, do you have any idea what you've done? That money could have set us all up for life. It still can, I said. It'll just be setting up my life instead of yours. This is insane, Scott said, running his hands through his hair. Mom, you can't run a business. You don't understand corporate finance or— You're right, I interrupted. I don't understand those things, but I understand something else. I understand my worth. I walked to the hall closet and retrieved my suitcases, setting them down in the foyer with deliberate precision. What are those for? Camilla asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. I'm moving out, I said. I've found a lovely apartment downtown, 2 bedrooms, a view of the park, and most importantly, it's mine. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Scott stumbled backward into a chair, while Camilla's mouth opened and closed without sound. You can't just leave, Scott finally managed. This is your home. We're your family. This stopped being my home the day you decided I was hired help rather than family, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. And family doesn't humiliate each other in front of strangers or treat each other like unpaid servants. But who'll— Camilla started, then stopped, realizing how her question would sound. Who'll cook and clean and manage your household? I finished for her. I suppose you'll have to hire someone. Of course they'll expect to be paid, unlike the worthless old maid who's been doing it for free. The words hung in the air between us, sharp with years of accumulated hurt. Mom, please, Scott said, his voice breaking slightly. Don't do this. We can work things out. We can change. For a moment, I wavered. This was my son, the little boy I'd raised and loved unconditionally. Part of me wanted to believe that change was possible, that we could rebuild something genuine from the wreckage of our relationship. But then I thought of Harold's letter, of his warning about people who might not have my best interests at heart, and I realized that some relationships are too damaged by manipulation and neglect to be salvaged. I love you, Scott, I said softly. I will always love you, but I won't sacrifice my dignity for that love anymore. I picked up my suitcases and walked toward the door, my steps steady and sure. If you walk out that door, Camilla called after me, her voice sharp with desperation, don't expect us to come crawling back when you realize you can't handle being alone. I paused at the threshold and turned back one final time. Camilla, I said, my voice filled with a peace I hadn't felt in decades. I've been alone for 15 years. Now I'm finally free. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and rose. The view was spectacular, but it was the silence that I treasured most, the blessed absence of criticism, demands, and subtle cruelties that had once filled my days. My life had become my own again. I attended board meetings at Morrison & Associates, where my questions about fiscal responsibility and ethical practices had already resulted in significant improvements to company operations. I'd enrolled in an art class and discovered a talent for watercolor painting that I'd never known I possessed. I'd reconnected with old friends who'd drifted away during my years of isolation. Most importantly, I'd learned to value my own company. The woman who'd once felt worthless without external validation now found joy in simple pleasures. Morning coffee on the balcony, afternoon walks in the park, evenings spent reading books that no one criticized as frivolous. Scott had called twice in 6 months. Both conversations had been awkward, filled with his attempts to bridge a gap that had grown too wide for casual repair. He'd mentioned that they'd hired a housekeeper, someone who charged $50 an hour for work I'd done for free. Camilla, I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, had initially tried to turn other family members against me, painting me as a selfish woman who'd abandoned her loving children for money. But Harold's reputation in the community had been too strong, and people remembered how devoted he'd been to me. The narrative had never gained traction. As darkness fell over the city, I went inside and settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea and one of Harold's old photo albums. There we were at our wedding, young and full of dreams. There we were with baby Scott, exhausted but blissful new parents. There we were on our 25th anniversary, still holding hands after all those years. Harold had known what he was doing when he structured my inheritance the way he did. He'd seen the future with clear eyes and had given me the tools I would need to reclaim my life. But more than that, he'd given me time. 15 years to understand exactly what I was being saved from. I closed the album and picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found Richard Thompson's number. "Richard," I said when he answered. "I've been thinking about that scholarship fund we discussed. The one for women returning to school later in life. I'd like to move forward with that." "Excellent," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "How much were you thinking of contributing?" $500,000 to start, I said, watching the city lights twinkle below my window. I want to help other women discover that it's never too late to reclaim their worth. As I hung up the phone, I felt Harold's presence with me, warm and approving. He'd protected me in death as he had in life, but the courage to use his gift, that had to come from me. And finally, at 72 years old, I'd found it. The worthless old maid was gone, replaced by a woman who knew exactly how much she was worth. And that worth couldn't be measured in dollars. It could only be measured in the quiet dignity of a life lived on her own terms. Outside my window, the city hummed with possibility, and for the first time in 15 years, I was free to explore it all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.